They say legends don't bleed, but those who've survived the encounter know better. Sasquatch, the towering phantom of the wilderness, isn't just myth, it's the shadow behind missing hikers, the force behind gutted livestock, the reason some trails run red. While officials stay silent and rangers file quiet reports, locals speak in whispers of bone-chilling howls and silhouettes too massive to be bears. These aren't stories, they're warnings, etched into bark, buried in snow, left behind in blood. From hunting trips gone wrong to nighttime cabin stalkings to eerie trailside encounters, this video features 6 terrifying Sasquatch incidents from deep woods across the globe. High Pines RV Retreat sat nestled against the edge of the Kittatinny Mountains in Sussex County, New Jersey, where dense oak and pine forests stretched for miles in every direction. The family-owned campsite had operated since 1963, drawing visitors who appreciated its secluded location and proximity to hiking trails. Local residents often spoke of the area's rich wildlife, though few mentioned the occasional unexplained sounds that echoed from the deeper woods after midnight. On May 28, 2025, trucker couple Rick and Dana Stubblefield pulled their 18-wheeler into the campground's gravel lot after 14 hours on the road. They had been hauling electronics from Atlanta to Boston when fatigue forced them to stop for the night. The couple had used High Pines several times over their 20-year driving career, always finding it peaceful and well-maintained. Rick parked their rig near the eastern edge of the campground, close to where the maintained grounds gave way to wild forest. Dana commented that the evening seemed unusually quiet, with none of the typical cricket chirping or owl calls they normally heard. The temperature hovered around 78 degrees with heavy humidity that made the air feel thick and oppressive. At 2:13 a.m., piercing screams from another camper jolted both Rick and Dana from deep sleep. Rick later told investigators that the screams sounded unlike anything human, describing them as a mixture of terror and agony that seemed to go on forever. Dana immediately grabbed their emergency radio while Rick peered through their small window toward the source of the commotion. What Rick witnessed next would haunt him for years. A massive shape, easily 8 feet tall and covered in dark, matted hair, was methodically overturning a travel trailer about 50 yards away. The creature moved with surprising speed and strength, lifting one end of the trailer and flipping it completely over as if it weighed nothing. Rick reported that the thing appeared to have impossibly long arms that hung nearly to the ground when it stood upright. The chaos escalated rapidly. Rick watched as the creature approached another RV and began clawing at its aluminum siding with what appeared to be massive hands. The metallic screeching sound of tearing metal mixed with human screams from inside the vehicle. Rick later estimated that the claw marks were at least 4 inches deep and ran the entire length of the 30-foot trailer. Donna, meanwhile, had barricaded herself inside their truck's small bathroom compartment after catching sight of the creature through their rear window. She would later describe seeing what she called a giant thing with matted hair covering its entire body. Most disturbing to Dana was her observation that where the creature's eyes should have been, there were only black pits that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The attack continued for approximately 15 minutes before the creature suddenly stopped and disappeared into the forest. Rick reported hearing heavy footsteps moving away from the campground, accompanied by deep guttural sounds that seemed to fade into the distance. The sudden silence that followed felt almost as terrifying as the chaos that had preceded it. When morning came, the full extent of the damage became apparent. 3 campers were found dead, their bodies showing signs of massive trauma, consistent with being struck by something incredibly powerful. 2 other campers remained missing despite extensive searches by local law enforcement and volunteer rescue teams. A trail of blood led from the destroyed campsite directly into the dense woods, but it vanished after about 200 yards. State police investigators arrived by mid-morning and spent 3 days examining the scene. They noted the damage patterns. The lead investigator, Detective Maria Santos, noted in her official report that the damage pattern was unlike anything she had encountered in 15 years of law enforcement. Despite the eyewitness testimony from Rick and Dana, authorities ultimately attributed the attack to a large black bear. Wildlife officials explained that bears occasionally exhibited aggressive behavior when protecting cubs or defending territory. They suggested that the unusual nature of the damage could be explained by an exceptionally large and agitated animal. Rick Stubblefield disagreed vehemently with the official explanation. He insisted that what he witnessed that night was not any known animal, describing movements and behaviors that defied natural explanation. The experience affected him so profoundly that he refused to drive routes that took him through forested areas and eventually changed careers entirely. Dana rarely spoke about that night, but when pressed, She maintained that conventional explanations failed to account for what she observed. The couple moved to Arizona 6 months later, seeking what Rick described as wide-open spaces where nothing could approach unseen. High Pines RV Retreat closed permanently 3 weeks after the incident, with the owners citing safety concerns and declining bookings. A remote mountain village in southern Bavaria lay nestled against the edge of the Alpine region, surrounded by dense pine forests that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. The village gained international recognition for its passion play, performed every 10 years since 1634, but locals knew it equally well for its isolated dairy farms scattered throughout the mountainous terrain. Ancient folklore spoke of der Waldteufel, a forest demon that emerged during harsh winters, though most residents dismissed such tales as remnants of superstitious times. In September 1987, 22-year-old Matthias Reichel returned from Munich to help his father manage their family dairy operation. The younger Reichel had spent 3 years studying agricultural sciences in the city, but mounting financial pressures forced him back to the remote farm that had belonged to his family for 4 generations. The property sat 2 miles from the village center, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through thick stands of Norway spruce and silver fir. Klaus Reichel, Matthias's father, had operated the farm alone since his wife's death 2 years earlier. The 63-year-old man maintained a herd of 37 Holstein cattle and had built a reputation for producing some of the region's finest milk. Neighbors respected Klaus for his work ethic and practical approach to farming, though they noted he had become increasingly withdrawn since his wife's passing. Matthias arrived on a crisp autumn morning to find his father examining something troubling in the eastern pasture. 3 of their prize cows lay dead near the fence line, their bodies showing massive trauma that Klaus described as crushing rather than typical predator attacks. The animals appeared to have been struck with tremendous force, breaking multiple ribs and causing internal injuries that seemed inconsistent with any known wildlife in the region. More disturbing was the discovery of their 4th cow, a pregnant heifer named Greta, lodged 15 feet up in a massive pine tree. The animal hung motionless among the branches, clearly dead, but positioned in a way that defied explanation. Matthias calculated that lifting a 600-pound cow to that height would require machinery or incredible strength beyond human capability. Klaus initially suspected vandalism or some elaborate prank, though he struggled to explain how anyone could have accomplished such a feat. The nearest neighbors lived over a mile away, and the isolated location made it unlikely that outsiders could have accessed the property undetected. Father and son spent the afternoon examining the scene for clues, but found only some unusual depressions in the soft earth that resembled oversized footprints. Local authorities arrived the following day to investigate what they classified as livestock destruction. The investigating officer, Sergeant Hans Muller, surveyed the area, made notes on the damage and the unusual tracks, and opened a formal case report. Muller noted in his report that the incident appeared to involve an unknown large animal, possibly a bear that had wandered down from higher elevations in search of food before winter hibernation. Klaus rejected the bear theory, pointing out that the dead cows showed no bite marks or typical claw patterns associated with bear attacks. He also questioned how any bear could have lifted a full-grown cow into a tree, arguing that even the largest brown bears lacked such capability. Muller acknowledged these inconsistencies but maintained that a bear remained the most logical explanation for the livestock deaths. 3 nights later, around midnight, both men were awakened by the sound of splintering wood coming from their barn. Klaus grabbed his hunting rifle, while Matthias followed with a powerful flashlight. Both men moved cautiously toward the source of the disturbance. They found their barn door completely destroyed, torn from its hinges, and scattered in pieces across the farmyard. Inside the barn, several cows showed signs of extreme agitation, huddling together in the far corner and refusing to approach the damaged entrance. Fresh hay bales had been scattered throughout the structure, and deep gouges marked the wooden walls at a height that suggested something much taller than a human had been present. The next morning, neighbors found Klaus Reichel's body in the forest, approximately 200 yards from his barn. The older man's spine had been broken, and his body showed the same crushing injuries observed in the dead cattle. A clear trail of massive footprints led from the barn into the dense woods, continuing for nearly half a mile before disappearing on rocky ground that retained no impressions. Matthias discovered his father's body when he failed to return from investigating the tracks alone. The young man immediately contacted authorities and provided a detailed account of the previous night's events. Police conducted an extensive search of the surrounding forest, but found no additional evidence beyond the footprint trail that ended abruptly on the stone outcropping. the official investigation concluded that Klaus Reichel had been killed by a pack of wild boars that had been reported in the area throughout the summer. Wildlife officials explained that aggressive boars were capable of inflicting fatal injuries on humans, particularly when protecting their territory or young. They dismissed the unusual footprints as unrelated to the death, suggesting they had been made by hiking boots worn by searchers. Matthias left the mountain village 6 weeks after his father's funeral, selling the farm to a development company and returning permanently to Munich. He never spoke publicly about the events of that autumn, though close friends reported that he refused to venture into forested areas and seemed genuinely terrified when the subject of wild animals arose in conversation. Kurokawa village in Tokushima Prefecture had been abandoned for nearly 2 decades when 3 university students decided to document its remains in March 2002. The remote mountain settlement, once home to 43 families, was gradually reclaimed by thick bamboo groves and misty trails that wound through the surrounding peaks. Local folklore attributed the village's abandonment to economic hardship, though older residents of nearby towns whispered about strange occurrences that had driven the last families away in the early 1980s. Ayaka Mori, a 21-year-old anthropology student from the Institute of Social Studies of a local college, had organized the expedition as part of her thesis on rural depopulation in modern Japan. She recruited 2 fellow students, Shun Takeda from the geography department and Daiichi Ito, who studied documentary photography, to help capture the village's current state and interview any remaining locals about its history. The trio arrived by bus at the nearest accessible point, a small mountain town called Yamashiro, before hiking 8 kilometers along an overgrown trail to reach Kurokawa. The path proved more challenging than anticipated, requiring them to push through dense bamboo stands and navigate around fallen trees that had blocked the original route. Ayaka noted that the bamboo seemed unusually thick and tall, creating a canopy so dense that even during midday, little sunlight reached the forest floor. They established their campsite near the village's old Shinto shrine, a weathered wooden structure that remained partially intact despite years of neglect. The shrine sat on a small hill overlooking the abandoned houses, most of which had collapsed under the weight of accumulated vegetation and harsh mountain weather. Daiichi spent the afternoon photographing the deteriorating buildings, while Ayaka and Shun recorded GPS coordinates and detailed descriptions of each structure. As evening approached, the students noticed an unusual quiet that seemed to blanket the entire area. Ayaka commented that typical forest sounds like bird calls and insect chirping were completely absent, creating an oppressive silence that felt unnatural for a mountain environment. The temperature dropped rapidly after sunset, and thick mist began rolling up from the valley below, obscuring their view of the surrounding landscape. Around 9 o'clock, while the students prepared their evening meal, they heard the first of what Ayaka later described as the most unsettling sounds she had ever encountered. Deep, guttural howls echoed from somewhere within the bamboo groves, seeming to come from multiple directions simultaneously. The sounds lasted for several minutes before stopping abruptly, leaving the 3 students staring nervously into the darkness beyond their small camp. Daiichi suggested the howls might be from wild boars or possibly Japanese macaques, both of which were known to inhabit the region's forests. However, Ayaka noted that the vocalizations seemed too deep and sustained to match any animal she was familiar with. Shun attempted to record the sounds with his digital equipment, but the howling had ceased before he could properly set up his recording device. The students spent a restless night in their tents, periodically awakened by similar howling that seemed to move around their campsite in a wide circle. Each time the sounds appeared to originate from a different location, making it impossible to determine how many creatures might be present or their exact distance from the camp. Ayaka later reported that the howling had an almost intelligent quality, as if whatever was making the sounds was deliberately trying to unnerve them. Dawn brought temporary relief as the mysterious vocalizations stopped completely with the first rays of sunlight. The students decided to explore deeper into the bamboo groves, hoping to find tracks or other evidence of whatever had been making the nocturnal sounds. Daiichi led the way with his camera equipment, while Ayaka and Shun followed, carefully documenting their route to avoid becoming lost in the maze-like bamboo stands. Approximately 200 meters from their campsite, they discovered an area where the bamboo had been systematically broken and twisted, creating what appeared to be a crude pathway through the dense growth. The damaged plants showed signs of tremendous force, with thick bamboo stalks snapped cleanly in half at heights of 8 to 10 feet above ground level. Ayaka estimated that creating such destruction would require either heavy machinery or incredible physical strength. That evening brought a repeat of the previous night's howling, but this time the sounds seemed closer and more aggressive. Around midnight, something began moving through the bamboo groves with enough force to snap branches and rustle vegetation audibly. The students huddled together in Ayaka's tent, listening as whatever was out there circled their campsite repeatedly throughout the night. Just before dawn on their third day, the creature made direct contact with their camp. Daichi had ventured outside his tent to investigate a particularly loud crashing sound when something massive emerged from the bamboo grove. Ayaka, peering through her tent's mesh window, witnessed what she described as a giant humanoid figure covered entirely in dark hair that hung nearly to the ground. The creature moved with surprising speed despite its size, covering the distance to Daichi in seconds. Ayaka reported that the thing's arms were disproportionately long, extending almost to its knees when it stood upright, and its movement seemed both ape-like and disturbingly human. Before either Ayaka or Shun could react, the creature had grabbed Daichi and disappeared into the bamboo grove, dragging the screaming student along what appeared to be the same pathway they had discovered earlier. Ayaka and Shun spent the remainder of the night frozen with terror, afraid to leave their tents or make any sound that might attract the creature's attention. At first light, they packed their equipment hastily and began the 8-kilometer hike back to Yamashiro, stopping only to mark their GPS location for later search efforts. Local police conducted an extensive search of the area over the following week, focusing on the bamboo groves where Daichi had disappeared. They found torn pieces of his clothing and several bloodstains on broken bamboo stalks, but no trace of the student himself. The official investigation concluded that a large black bear had likely attacked Daichi, though investigators acknowledged that Asiatic black bears were rarely aggressive toward humans and typically avoided contact entirely. Ayaka provided detailed testimony about the creature she had witnessed, but authorities dismissed her account as trauma-induced hallucination brought on by the stress of seeing her friend attacked. Wildlife experts consulted during the investigation stated that no known animal in Japan matched Ayaka's description, and suggested that poor lighting conditions and extreme fear had distorted her perceptions of what was likely a bear encounter. The case officially remained open but inactive, with Daichi Ito listed as missing and presumed deceased. Ayaka completed her university studies, but never returned to rural research. Instead, she accepted a position with a Tokyo corporation that kept her firmly within urban environments. She moved to a 23rd-floor apartment with no windows that faced any green spaces. She consistently declined to discuss her experiences in Kurokawa village with reporters or researchers interested in the case. The Atacama Desert near Calama in northern Chile stretched endlessly under brutal sun, creating a landscape so barren that scientists used it to test equipment destined for Mars. Mining companies had extracted copper from the region since the early 1900s, occasionally uncovering fossilized remains of ancient animals that had lived when the area supported more vegetation. Local workers grew accustomed to finding strange bones and preserved specimens in the dry earth, though most discoveries proved to be prehistoric llamas or other indigenous species that had died out centuries earlier. In August 1974, geologist Dr. Luis Andrade arrived at a remote copper survey site 43 kilometers southeast of Calama to assess mineral deposits for Sociedad Minera San Aurelio. The 38-year-old scientist had spent 12 years studying South American geology and had worked extensively throughout Chile's northern desert regions. His assistant, 26-year-old Esteban Rojas, served as both field technician and camp coordinator for their 2-week survey mission. The men established their temporary outpost in a prefabricated shelter positioned on a plateau overlooking the proposed mining area. Their nearest neighbors were workers at an active copper mine 18 kilometers to the north, but radio communication with the outside world remained their only regular contact. Dr. Andrade planned to collect soil samples and conduct preliminary excavations to determine the feasibility of large-scale mining operations in the region. On their 4th day, while digging test holes near what appeared to be an ancient riverbed, Esteban discovered something unusual, embedded in a layer of sediment, approximately 2 meters below the surface. Initial excavation revealed what appeared to be a large skull, though its size and structure differed significantly from any known animal species in the region. Dr. Andrade carefully extracted the specimen and transported it back to their shelter for detailed examination. The skull measured nearly 40 centimeters in length and showed characteristics that seemed to combine ape-like and human features in ways that Dr. Andrade found deeply troubling. The cranial capacity appeared larger than that of any known primate, while the jaw structure suggested an omnivorous diet similar to early human ancestors. Most disturbing were the eye sockets, which were significantly larger than those found in modern humans and positioned in a way that suggested excellent night vision capabilities. Dr. Andrade spent 2 days studying the skull in depth, recording its structure and proportions in meticulous field notes. He noted that the bone structure appeared remarkably well preserved, despite what seemed to be considerable age, and that certain characteristics suggested the creature had been significantly larger than modern humans. The scientists began to suspect that he had discovered evidence of an unknown hominid species that had somehow survived in South America long after similar creatures had vanished from other continents. Rather than reporting the discovery through official channels, Dr. Andrade decided to keep the skull secret until he could conduct a more thorough analysis back in Santiago. He understood that such an extraordinary find would require extensive verification and peer review before being announced to the scientific community. The geologist carefully wrapped the specimen and stored it in a secure container within their shelter. On the evening of August 19th, both men were working late in their temporary laboratory when they heard vehicles approaching their isolated outpost. Dr. Andrade peered through their single window and observed several military-style trucks surrounding their shelter. Though he could not identify any official markings or determine who might be conducting such an operation in the remote desert location, armed men dressed in civilian clothing forced entry into the shelter and began systematically searching through all equipment and specimens. Dr. Andrade later reported that the intruders seemed to know exactly what they were looking for, heading directly to the container where he had stored the unusual skull. When Esteban attempted to question their authority to seize the materials, one of the men struck him with a rifle butt, knocking the young assistant to the ground. The confrontation escalated rapidly when Esteban tried to reach for their radio equipment, apparently hoping to contact the mining company's security office for assistance. Dr. Andrade witnessed what he described as a savage attack, with multiple assailants using knives and other weapons to kill his assistant in what appeared to be a deliberately brutal manner. The geologist himself remained unharmed throughout the incident, though he was forced to watch while the men methodically destroyed most of their research equipment. After removing the skull and several other specimens, the attackers departed as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving Dr. Andrade alone with Esteban's mutilated body and the ruins of their research camp. The traumatized scientist spent the night barricaded inside what remained of their shelter, too terrified to venture outside until dawn brought enough light to assess his situation. Dr. Andrade gathered what supplies he could carry and began walking toward the nearest mining facility, a journey of 18 kilometers across harsh desert terrain. Dehydration and shock made the trek nearly fatal, but he managed to reach a truck stop on the main highway after 36 hours of walking. The scientist's appearance and incoherent account of recent events initially led workers to assume he was suffering from severe heat stroke. Local authorities conducted a perfunctory investigation of the remote outpost, finding Esteban's body and confirming that valuable equipment had been stolen from the site. The official report attributed the death to an attack by feral dogs, citing the nature of the wounds and the isolation of the location as evidence supporting this conclusion. Investigators noted that wild dog packs occasionally posed dangers to isolated workers in the desert regions. Dr. Andrade provided detailed testimony about the armed men who had attacked their camp, but authorities dismissed his account as trauma-induced hallucinations brought on by extreme stress and dehydration. Military officials denied any knowledge of operations in the area, and mining company executives suggested that the scientist had imagined the entire confrontation while suffering from a psychological breakdown following his assistant's tragic death. The skull and other specimens collected during the survey disappeared completely, with no official record of their existence or scientific significance. Dr. Andrade attempted to pursue the matter through academic channels, but found that his colleagues were reluctant to support claims that seemed to lack any physical evidence. His reputation within the geological community suffered significantly, and research funding became increasingly difficult to obtain. 1 year after the incident, Dr. Luis Andrade failed to return from a solo field trip in the mountains near Valparaiso. His abandoned vehicle was found beside a remote road, but extensive searches revealed no trace of the missing scientist. Authorities concluded that he had likely become lost in the rugged terrain and succumbed to exposure, though his body was never recovered, despite weeks of intensive searching effort. The Republic of Karelia spans hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of pristine wilderness near the Finnish border, where vast pine forests remain largely untouched by industrial development. The Petrozavodsk region contains some of Russia's most remote logging operations, with small crews working in isolation for months at a time to harvest timber for the struggling Soviet economy. Local residents knew these forests as places where ancient traditions persisted and unexplained phenomena occurred far from the scrutiny of government officials. In February 1991, a logging crew from the remote township of Mirovka reported disturbing incidents to their supervisor at the regional forestry office. The six-man team, led by veteran foreman Viktor Petrov, had been working a site approximately 60 kilometers northeast of Petrozavodsk when they began encountering evidence of what they described as an unknown large animal moving through their work area during nighttime hours. Forestry officer Irina Sokolova received the crew's report on February 14th and initially dismissed their concerns as typical wilderness folklore that often emerged during long periods of isolation. The 34-year-old official had worked in forest management for 8 years and was accustomed to workers reporting unusual animal sightings, most of which proved to be bears, wolves, or other wildlife that seemed larger and more threatening to men who spent weeks alone in the vast wilderness. However, the logging crew's account contained details that Irina found increasingly troubling. Viktor Petrov reported discovering bipedal tracks in fresh snow that measured nearly 60 centimeters in length and showed clear impressions of what appeared to be toes rather than the pad marks typical of known forest animals. The foreman also described hearing deep, guttural roars echoing through the trees during early morning hours, sounds unlike anything produced by bears, wolves, or other wildlife familiar to experienced woodsmen. Most concerning was the crew's report that something had been systematically damaging their equipment during overnight hours. Chainsaws had been found scattered throughout their work site, some thrown distances that would require tremendous strength. Their supply shed had been torn apart with what appeared to be bare hands, leaving claw marks in the wooden walls that extended far higher than any known animal could reach while standing on the ground. Irina decided to investigate the reports personally, departing Petrozavodsk on February 21st with a government-issued snowmobile and supplies for a 3-day expedition. The forestry officer had extensive experience in wilderness survival and felt confident in her ability to assess the situation objectively. She planned to examine the reported tracks, interview the logging crew, and determine whether their claims warranted further investigation by wildlife authorities. The journey to the logging site required nearly 6 hours of travel through increasingly remote terrain, with the final 20 kilometers accessible only by snowmobile due to deep drifts that blocked vehicular access. Irina arrived at the camp just before sunset and immediately noticed the unusual quiet that seemed to pervade the entire area. The normal sounds of forest wildlife were completely absent, creating an oppressive silence that even the experienced woodsman found unnerving. Viktor Petrov showed Irina the damaged equipment and pointed out several sets of tracks that remained clearly visible in snow that had fallen 2 days earlier. The forestry officer examined the impressions carefully and found herself unable to explain their size and distinctive characteristics. The tracks showed definite toe impressions and what appeared to be an arch structure similar to human feet, but the scale was far beyond anything she had encountered in her professional experience. That evening, while interviewing the logging crew in their shared cabin, Irina learned additional details that increased her concern about the situation. The men reported that the mysterious roaring had been occurring regularly for nearly 2 weeks, always during pre-dawn hours when visibility was limited. They also described finding trees that had been stripped of bark in distinctive patterns, as if something with enormous hands had been deliberately marking territory throughout the forest. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Irina was awakened by splintering wood and the panicked shouts of the logging crew. She emerged from her sleeping bag to find that the cabin's heavy wooden door had been torn completely from its hinges and lay in pieces across the floor. One of the loggers, 38-year-old Dmitry Volkov, was missing from his bunk, and bloodstains marked the threshold where the door had been removed. The remaining crew members huddled together in the far corner of the cabin, too terrified to venture outside and search for their missing colleague. Irina grabbed her emergency radio and attempted to contact forestry headquarters, but atmospheric conditions prevented clear transmission. The men spent the remainder of the night barricaded inside what remained of their shelter, listening to heavy footsteps moving around the building and occasional impacts that shook the entire structure. At first light, Irina and 2 of the braver loggers conducted a search for Dmitry Volkov. They found his body approximately 100 meters from the cabin, half buried in snow and showing signs of massive trauma that had clearly been fatal. The man's spine appeared to have been broken, and his body was twisted in ways that suggested he had been lifted and thrown with tremendous force. More disturbing was the trail of enormous footprints that led from the cabin to where Dmitry's body lay, and then continued in a straight line into the deepest part of the forest. Irina measured the clearest impressions and found them to be nearly twice the length of her own boots, with clear indentations showing what appeared to be 5 distinct toes on each foot. The stride length between individual tracks suggested that whatever had made them possessed legs significantly longer than those of any human. Irina followed the track trail for over 2 kilometers, documenting the path in detailed sketches and notes, and noting that the impressions remained remarkably consistent throughout their length. The tracks showed no deviation or wandering typical of animal movement. Instead, they followed an almost perfectly straight line, suggesting intelligent navigation through the dense forest. Eventually, the trail reached an area of rocky ground where no further impressions could be detected. The forestry officer remained at the site for another day, documenting the area and noting where unusual tracks had appeared. However, any trace of the incident had already been erased by time and weather. She noted that the creature appeared to walk exclusively on 2 legs, as no handprints or knuckle impressions were found anywhere along the extensive trail. This bipedal locomotion distinguished the unknown animal from bears, which occasionally leave tracks that might be confused with human footprints when they rear up on their hind legs. Regional authorities conducted a brief investigation of Dmitry Volkov's death, classifying it as an animal-related incident after examining the scene and interviewing witnesses. Wildlife experts consulted during the investigation concluded that an unusually large brown bear had likely been responsible, though they acknowledged that certain aspects of the evidence seemed inconsistent with typical bear behavior. The official report dismissed the unusual footprint evidence as misidentified bear tracks that had been distorted by melting and refreezing cycles in the snow. Investigators explained that atmospheric conditions and the witnesses' traumatic stress could account for discrepancies between their observations and the established behavior patterns of known wildlife species. Irina Sokolova submitted her detailed report to forestry headquarters, but found that her superiors showed little interest in pursuing the matter further. The logging operation was suspended indefinitely, and the surviving crew members were reassigned to locations closer to populated areas. Within 6 months, Irina had quietly resigned from her position and relocated to St. Petersburg, where she accepted administrative work that kept her far from wilderness areas. When approached by researchers interested in the case, Irina would display the image briefly, but consistently refused to discuss details of her experience. Her only comment regarding the incident was her assertion that bears do not walk in perfectly straight lines for kilometers through dense forest terrain. The Sierra Mixte Mountains near Totontepec rose sharply from the Oaxacan Valley floor, creating a rugged landscape of cloud forests and indigenous communities that had maintained their traditions for over 1,000 years. The region attracted occasional tourists seeking authentic cultural experiences, though most visitors limited themselves to day trips rather than venturing into remote jungle settlements where ancient beliefs still governed daily life. In July 2013, 2 researchers, Michael and Janet, arrived in Totontepec to witness the annual Summer Maize Festival, a celebration honoring the successful planting season with traditional dances and communal feasting. Michael, an ethnobotanist affiliated with a regional university, was researching pre-Columbian agricultural practices, while Janet hoped to photograph the ceremonies for a potential exhibition on contemporary indigenous traditions. The festival began on July 23rd, with elaborate decorations adorning the village's central plaza and traditional foods being prepared for anticipated crowds. Local residents wore colorful ceremonial clothing reflecting centuries of cultural continuity, and musicians performed on instruments that predated European contact. The researchers found themselves welcomed warmly by villagers who seemed genuinely pleased to share their heritage with respectful visitors. On the festival's second day, Michael expressed interest in exploring hiking trails that wound through jungle-covered ridges surrounding Totontepec. Several villagers warned the pair that forest paths could be confusing for outsiders, and that dangerous wildlife, including jaguars, inhabited the denser vegetation at higher elevations. Village elder Rosa Martinez specifically advised them to remain on marked trails and return before sunset. Despite these warnings, Michael and Janet decided to attempt a moderate hike to photograph tropical vegetation and observe exotic bird species inhabiting the cloud forest ecosystem. Michael carried a GPS device and felt confident in their navigation abilities, while Janet brought extensive camera equipment to document the region's remarkable biodiversity. The pair departed around noon on July 25th, following a well-maintained trail that initially climbed gradually through coffee plantations and secondary forest growth. After 2 hours of hiking, They reached a ridge offering spectacular views of the surrounding mountains and valleys. Janet spent considerable time photographing the scenery, while Michael collected plant specimens for later identification. Continuing beyond the viewpoint, the trail became less distinct as it entered primary forest, where massive trees created a canopy so dense that little sunlight reached ground level. The researchers found themselves relying increasingly on Michael's GPS device, as natural landmarks became difficult to distinguish in the uniform jungle environment. Around 4 o'clock, Michael realized they had lost the main trail and were following what appeared to be an animal path leading deeper into the uninhabited forest. His GPS showed their location as approximately 3 kilometers from Totontepec, but thick vegetation made it impossible to see the village or identify the correct direction for return. The pair decided to retrace their steps to the ridge viewpoint, where they could reorient themselves and locate the proper trail. However, the animal path proved difficult to navigate in reverse, and several similar tracks branched off in different directions, creating confusion about their original route. As evening approached, Janet grew increasingly anxious about their situation. The jungle seemed darker and more threatening as daylight faded, and strange sounds echoed from surrounding vegetation that neither could identify. Michael attempted to use his cell phone but discovered that they were beyond the communication tower range. Around 7 o'clock, while searching for familiar landmarks in gathering darkness, Janet heard heavy breathing coming from somewhere very close to their location. Both stopped moving and listened carefully, trying to determine the source and whether it represented a threat to their safety. A massive shape emerged from dense vegetation approximately 20 meters away, moving with surprising speed despite its enormous size. Janet later described seeing what appeared to be a huge, fur-covered humanoid figure that stood at least 8 feet tall and moved faster than anything she had ever witnessed. Before either could react, the creature grabbed Michael around the waist with impossibly long arms. He managed one brief scream before being dragged into the jungle with such speed that Janet lost sight of them within seconds. The sound of breaking branches continued for 30 seconds before complete silence returned. Janet remained frozen with terror for several minutes, afraid to move or make sounds that might attract the creature's attention. Eventually, she began calling Michael's name repeatedly, but her shouts echoed without response, leaving her feeling completely isolated and vulnerable. The terrified woman spent the night huddled against a large tree, constantly listening for sounds indicating the creature's return or Michael's presence. At first light, she began moving toward what she hoped was Totontepec's direction, following a small stream that she reasoned must lead to lower elevations. After 6 hours of difficult travel through dense vegetation, Janet encountered a search party organized by village residents when the pair failed to return. Over 3 days, expanded search teams found scattered pieces of Michael's clothing and bloodstains near where Janet reported the attack, but no other evidence explaining his disappearance. Local authorities classified the incident as a probable jaguar attack, although many village residents privately believed the couple had encountered one of the Tsitsimime, ancient sky demons described in local mythology as powerful spirits. Janet left Mexico immediately and never traveled internationally again.